So hey everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of the renewed Angular tutorial. The topics that we're going to cover in this first video are some very important basic starting stuff, right? So we're going to cover making a new project, right? Building that new project, testing that project, and we're going to go over some binding, right? We're also going to check on a certain package called HTTP server. So this video will be assuming that every watcher has already installed Node, has npm available, has already installed Angular CLI, and also has the HTTP server package. But I will, just in case, show the command necessary to install the HTTP server. So let's go ahead and get right in. So the first command that you need to be aware of is ng-new. We're going to open a new terminal here, right? Let it load up. And I'm going to show you exactly how that looks. So we have ng-new right here. And what ng-new does is that it creates a new project in your current directory. So whatever directory you've currently navigated to, you're going to have a new project developed there. And it's going to ask you 3 questions after you send in this command, right? It's going to first ask you the name of the project. Then it's going to ask if you want routing pre-ready in that project. And thirdly, it's going to ask you if you want to use CSS, SCSS, or the other kinds of styling available. I always use CSS. So I have a new project here already called it Angular Tutorials. I do have routing enabled, and I've used CSS for this. I always use CSS. So the first thing that I'm going to show you, other than this, is ng-build. So you might notice this distribution folder here in the architecture that we have set up here. But before that, this architecture here is set up when we create our new project, right? This architecture here is what we work in when creating our Angular project. And everything has to be within this, right? And you have to work with the rules of this architecture, right? This distribution folder here, let me go ahead and delete it actually. What that's going to do is actually contain the build, but I want you to see it being made, right? The main area of this application is within the source folder right here. This is the heart, the beating heart of your application. And in the app folder here, we have the first module and the first component. Later down in further videos, we'll be talking about what exactly these are. But right now, I'm just gonna tell you just how to start up your project, right? So what is ng-build? Well, so what ng-build does is it builds down the architecture, right? It creates a smaller runnable group where all the Typescript has been transferred to JavaScript, and it's only a few files, right? So let's run it. Go ahead and see what that results in. ng-build is gonna go ahead and put everything together, and it's gonna take a bit of time. So let's see. Alright, so our build is complete, and as you can see, the distribution folder was remade, and inside it there's an Angular Tutorials folder, and it contains all the files that truly comprise our application. So this is everything when it's compressed, basically, right? So it's in a much smaller form now. We have an index.html file, the main.js, polyfills.js, runtime.js style sheet, and a licensed text file, and also the icon. So when you have this distribution folder, what exactly do you do to run it? Well, what you need for that is something called the HTTP server, and you can get that with Node Packet Manager by running npm install, and I always install things globally, HTTP server. So that's how you would go ahead and do that. I already have it installed, right? So what I would simply do is HTTP server dist, right, Angular tutorials. That'll be correct. Let's hop back into Edge, follow that link. Alright. Okay, so this is our build and it's running. So whenever you create a new project with Angular, right, you're gonna have this default front page here. And this is what we're looking at the moment, being run from the build. And the other way that you can run your Angular application, the one made for testing rather than deployment and distribution, that would be ng-serve. So let me go ahead, head back into VS Code and show you that. So what ng-serve does is, unlike HTTP server, which uses this index.html here in the distribution folder to start an HTTP server, it uses this index.html here and these files to run the testing environment, right? And you might be wondering why exactly you have to use HTTP server to run your dist folder, given that there's ngserve. Well, the way it works is that when you use HTTP server to run your built application, it releases several JavaScript descriptions that allow and also allows absolute links in the relative domain, meaning you normally wouldn't be able to reliably access resources with absolute paths, but with this you can, right? And the way ngserve works is that it's automated to set up certain things just for testing. So you wouldn't use that for a distribution because it's not configured for that. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new terminal here, because this terminal is currently running the HTTP server, right? And this one we're going to run ngserve, and then we're going to have it show up on localhost port 4200 by default. You can also use -p and a port number if you want to particularly pick a certain port. I'm going to give this a little bit of time and it'll be up in a bit. There we go, it's ready. So let's load up this link now. I'm going to follow it. I'm going to hop into Edge, and here we go. So as you can see, the same exact thing. The only difference is that this one is being run from the build and this one is being run from the architecture. So whenever I make a change, let's say for example I go into this index.html, not this one actually, going to the app component HTML. Oh, I made a mistake and didn't switch the camera actually, so let me go ahead and show you real quick. Yeah, in VS Code what I did is that I got rid of this, all of this default stuff here, I got rid of that. So yeah, let's save that again, and then it recompiled. You can see that down here, recompiled, and then it's now blank, right? Because it updated immediately with that new information. The build on the other hand is still the same because we haven't changed the build. And if we wanted this to change, we would have to run ng build again, which is a much slower and a painstaking process, right? It's a lot quicker to just press Ctrl S and have your page recompile. So that's why you use ngserve for testing. So the next thing that we're gonna touch on, let's see. I'll take this brief moment to explain a bit of what we see here in this index.html file. So this app root here is where our application really takes place, right? So everything we do within the app source folder here, this is where it's being rendered into, this app root, right? And as for this app component here, this router outlet element here is where all of the routed information is going to, and we're going to touch on that when we make it to routing. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, I'm going to show you some binding. And in order to understand that, you need to know that the components, these component parts you see here, app component CSS, app component HTML, and app component TS, these three right here, as well as this technically, but this is a testing thing, right? A very particular thing that we won't be getting into right now. But these pieces here, they all come as a package deal, right? They all communicate with each other. They're basically a family, right? This component owns this HTML, and it also owns this CSS, right? So this CSS will be applied to this HTML through the app component Typescript file, and the app component.html is rendered into the view by the app component Typescript file. As you can see here, it uses template URL to access the HTML file and style URL to access the style file. So yeah, so they come as a package deal. And how this works for binding is that the component shares information with the HTML. So this variable, for example, title, let's say we wanted it to show up into the view, right? We want it to show up in the HTML. In order to see, we use double curly braces and we simply type in the variable name here. See, it recognizes it. The error goes away. Let's save that, and you'll see that the value of this string now appears in the view. So let's go ahead and see that. So let's switch from the build to the ngserve one, and as you can see, it now says Angular tutorials. And that's because that is the value of the variable title that is within the component. All right. So another kind of binding that we can do, I'm going to show you real quick, is attribute binding. So let's say we have a p tag. Let's have it say this is a p tag. It has an attribute called title, right, normally. And what this does is that whatever you assign it as a value, that string is what shows up when you hover above it. So when we hover above this p tag, we would see a tiny box show up and it would say string, right? What we're going to do is we're going to set up incoming binding on the title attribute so that it takes the value of this title variable from the Angular. And now, this is a p tag. When we hover over that, it's going to show inside that little hover box. It's going to say, what's it going to say? Angular tutorials, right? So let's go ahead and take a look. Alright, we have our p tag here. Let's hover above it, and what does it say? Angular tutorials. So you can see it working. You can see the process. You can see it working, right? So let's head back over to the VS Code. So the third type of binding is outgoing binding, which is majorly used for events, right? So there are certain events that you have in Angular, right? One of which is click, but you can see a long list of them here. What we're going to show is the click one. And as you can see, outgoing binding uses round braces instead of the square braces. We're going to use the click event here, right? And what that's going to do is it's going to pass to this expression a certain variable known as $event. And that stores all the information of the event, including which tag triggered it. We're going to pass that event to a function called handleEvent, which currently doesn't exist, but we're about to make it, right? So when p tag is clicked, the event variable is going to be passed to handleEvent, and it's going to be managed in Typescript. So that's how we're passing the information over to the Typescript into Angular from the HTML. So let's go back into the component. Let's make our handleEvent function. And it's going to need a parameter for accepting the event. So this is E of type event. And let's actually just make that private. You know, might as well. Oh, whoopsie. This isn't a constructor, so we can't be using accessors here. So let's go ahead here and do some stuff with it, right? So this event, the most important thing that it passes is the target. That is an object representing the tag, the element that had triggered this event. But before we're able to use it, we need to cast it so that Typescript knows what kind of tag we're dealing with here. And the type of tag we're dealing with here is an HTML paragraph element. So we cast it as an HTML paragraph element in this case, because in other cases you have stuff like HTML input element, and you have classes for all the elements here, so you can cast it and use that target. So now that the target is casted, we can do something like access the inner HTML. And what that does is that it represents everything in between the tags. And currently what we have between the tags is this is a p tag. So what we're going to do is on the click, it's going to change that. And we're going to make it switch to, let's say, today's date, 3/10/2022, right? So whenever we click that p tag, it's going to trigger this event, pass the event information into the Angular, and we're going to use it to change the inner HTML of the element. And it's going to change it to today's date, right? So let's go ahead and hop over back into Edge. Okay, we have our p tag, and let's click it. There we go. So our event triggers and the information is changed. The inner HTML has been changed. And that is how you use event binding. So you can use it on pretty much anything. So let's say you had an input tag, right? Let's say you had an input tag. Let's switch back over to our VS Code. Let's create an input tag here. We're gonna input text. So let's say we wanted to bind the value of this input to something we had in the Angular. So we're gonna make up a variable and we're gonna call it text field, right? It doesn't exist, so it throws an error, but we're gonna make it. text field is a string, and it starts out as a blank string. Okay, so now it's gonna bind, it's gonna use incoming binding, right? It's gonna make the value of this input anything that we have in this text field. Currently it's empty. I'm gonna actually change that to let's see, some random word. We set it to moon, right? So let's see what happens there. Let's check what that input is actually showing now that we've done this. So as you can see here, this text input, it initializes as moon because of the binding that was carried out. But this is only one-way binding, right? What this means is that the information is coming from the Angular into the HTML, right? But it's not going from the HTML into the Angular, right? So that's what we mean by one-way binding and incoming binding, right? So these square brackets represent incoming binding and round brackets represent outgoing binding. So let's say we wanted it to match it both ways, right? So we're going to make outgoing binding for the value, right? And for the value, let's say we want to, we're not going to use the regular handle event function. We're going to make a new function to handle this event, right? And we're going to name it accept text, right? And it's going to accept the event. We just need to go ahead and make that function now accept text. It's going to accept, yeah, E as in event. And then we're gonna have to do what we did before, E target. We're gonna cast it as an HTML input element. And when we get that, let's see, it's simply going to take that text field. So we can get the value from this. You can get the value. We're gonna assign that value to this dot text field. So whenever that event triggers, it's going to take the value of the HTML input element and put it into text field. But at the same time, it's also taking the value of text field and putting it into the HTML input value. So what we have here is two-way binding. They're now essentially the same thing. Regardless of whichever one you change, they're both going to always be the same thing, and that is the purpose of two-way binding. So that's just an example there, and that is the last thing that we'll be covering in this video. I hope it was a good learning experience for everyone watching, and as usual, I'd love your feedback in the comments if you have anything to say. Thank you for watching. I hope you come in for the next video as well, where we'll be covering services, pipes, directives, and how to use them.